The evening buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of a grand orchestra playing in the background. It was the kind of wedding reception that made headlines: elegance, wealth, and exclusivity all wrapped into one dazzling affair. Every detail had been meticulously planned, from the crystal chandeliers casting golden hues over the guests to the imported floral arrangements adorning the lavish banquet tables. Among the crowd of well-dressed socialites and business magnates stood Nathan Reid, the groom, a man whose name alone commanded attention in elite circles. Clad in a perfectly tailored suit, he radiated confidence, standing beside his stunning bride, Victoria, whose diamond-studded gown sparkled under the grand ballroom's soft glow. They were the picture-perfect couple, the embodiment of success and affluence. Yet, beneath the carefully curated image of joy and triumph, something felt off. Nathan couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the weight of expectations pressing down on him, the relentless need to uphold his reputation, or perhaps it was the exhaustion from the whirlwind of preparations leading up to this day. Whatever it was, he pushed it aside, offering polite smiles and shaking hands with distinguished guests. Then something, or rather, someone caught his eye. Across the room, weaving between tables with practiced efficiency, was a waitress clearing plates and refilling glasses. Her posture was poised, her movements precise, yet there was something in the way she carried herself that sent a chill down Nathan's spine. The dim lighting obscured her features at first, but as she turned, the soft glow of the chandeliers illuminated her face. His breath hitched. It was her. For a split second, everything else faded. The music, the murmuring guests, even the gentle touch of Victoria's hand resting lightly on his arm. All that remained was the stark, inescapable reality of the woman standing before him. Sophie. The woman he had once vowed to spend his life with. The woman he had let slip through his fingers. And she was pregnant. His chest tightened as his gaze dropped to the unmistakable swell beneath her plain uniform. 1,000 thoughts collided in his mind, scrambling for meaning, for answers. How long had it been since they had spoken? Since she walked away from their marriage? 6 months? 7? Yet here she was, visibly expecting a child that, if the timing was right, could only be his. Sophie's face remained unreadable, though there was a flicker of something: anger, hurt, maybe even defiance, before she turned away, pretending not to notice him. But it was too late. Nathan had seen her, and nothing could undo that moment of recognition. Driven by an urgency he didn't fully understand, he stepped away from Victoria and moved toward Sophie, maneuvering past guests and servers with a singular focus. As he reached her, she looked up, her expression carefully neutral, though he could see the tension in her clenched jaw, in the way she gripped the tray she was holding. Sophie. His voice came out lower than he intended, barely above a whisper. She straightened, meeting his gaze head-on. "Excuse me, sir," she said coolly, as if he were just another guest, another stranger at the reception. His brows furrowed. What are you doing here?" She exhaled sharply, as if exhausted by the mere thought of answering. "I'm working," she said plainly. "What does it look like?" Nathan's eyes darted back to her stomach. He swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. "You're pregnant." Sophie's lips parted slightly, but no words came. She could have denied it, could have said nothing, but the truth was right there, undeniable. His mind reeled. Why hadn't she told him? Had she planned to keep this from him forever? Was this the real reason she had walked away so easily, because she thought he wouldn't care? His thoughts were cut short by the sharp click of heels against the marble floor. "Nathan?" He turned. Victoria stood just a few feet away, her brows knitted together in confusion. "Who is she?" Nathan hesitated. "An old friend," he muttered, though the words tasted like a lie the moment they left his lips. Victoria's gaze flicked between him and Sophie, suspicion darkening her eyes. Sophie, however, said nothing. Instead, she shifted the tray in her hands, her movements swift, purposeful. "If you'll excuse me," she murmured, stepping past them without a second glance. Nathan wanted to stop her, to demand answers, but the weight of Victoria's stare held him back. He remained frozen, watching as Sophie disappeared into the crowd, his entire world tilting on its axis. Nothing about this night would ever be the same again. Nathan Reid hadn't always been the man who commanded boardrooms and dominated financial markets. There was a time when he was just another ambitious college student, scraping by with barely enough money for textbooks and instant ramen. Back then, success wasn't measured in profits or acquisitions. It was measured in stolen moments of laughter, in dreams whispered under the flickering glow of a dorm room lamp. And through every sleepless night and every uncertain step toward the future, Sophie Carter had been right there beside him. They met during their sophomore year at a crowded coffee shop just off campus. He had been juggling too many books, too little sleep, and one dangerously full cup of black coffee. She had been the one to reach out, steadying him before the inevitable spill. "Careful," she had said with a teasing smile, her emerald eyes bright with amusement. That was how it started. What followed was the kind of love story that felt unshakable. The kind that wasn't built on fleeting passion, but on something deeper: loyalty, resilience, and an unwavering belief in each other. Sophie had always been the steady force in Nathan's life, balancing his restless ambition with her quiet strength. When his first startup crumbled under the weight of financial failure, she didn't flinch. Instead, she picked up extra shifts at a local diner to help cover their bills, all while encouraging him to try again. "This is just one chapter, Nathan," she had whispered to him one night, her fingers laced with his as they sat on their tiny apartment floor, surrounded by unpaid invoices and rejection letters. Not the whole book. She never doubted him, even when he doubted himself. When success finally came, it wasn't an overnight miracle. It was the result of endless sacrifices, relentless effort, and a belief that refused to be shaken. Nathan had fought for his dreams, and Sophie had fought right alongside him. Their wedding had been simple, a quiet ceremony in the backyard of Sophie's childhood home. No extravagant ballrooms, no luxury venues, just a handful of close friends, soft candlelight, and the two of them promising forever. For a while, it felt like they had won. But success is a cruel thing. It doesn't just change circumstances, it changes people. As Nathan's business empire grew, so did the demands on his time. What had once been late-night brainstorming sessions in their tiny apartment turned into back-to-back meetings, overseas trips, and high-stakes negotiations. Sophie tried to understand. At first, she convinced herself that it was just a phase, that the long nights and missed dinners were temporary, that the man she had loved so fiercely, the one who had once held her hand through every storm, would eventually find his way back to her. But as months turned into years, the distance between them grew insurmountable. Their conversations, once filled with dreams and laughter, became transactional, quick exchanges about logistics and schedules rather than feelings and fears. Nathan's world became consumed by business, by numbers and strategies, by the insatiable hunger for more. And Sophie? She became a shadow of the woman she had once been, trapped in a marriage where she was no longer seen, no longer heard. The man who had once held her close on cold nights, who had whispered reassurances when the world felt uncertain, had become a stranger in their own home. She watched him charm investors, network with the elite, and present himself as a man of power and vision. But when he looked at her, there was none of that warmth left, just obligation, just routine. She had sacrificed so much to build a life with him. But now, she was beginning to wonder if she had simply built a life for him, one where she no longer belonged. She never imagined that love could erode this way, that it wouldn't be a single catastrophic event that broke them, but rather a slow, relentless erosion of everything they had once been. And yet, despite it all, she still wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. But deep down she feared that Nathan already had. Nathan Reid had always believed that success required sacrifice. What he hadn't realized, at least not at first, was that the greatest price he would pay wouldn't be in dollars or sleepless nights. It would be in love. When his company finally took off, it was like standing in the eye of a storm. One moment, he and Sophie were struggling to make ends meet, counting every dollar to cover rent. The next, investors were throwing money at him. Clients were fighting for his attention, and his calendar was booked months in advance. Nathan thrived in the chaos. Deals closed, numbers soared. His name began appearing in business magazines, lauded as a self-made entrepreneur who had defied the odds. And yet, in his relentless pursuit of power, of financial security, of the validation he had always craved, something shifted. Late nights at the office turned into weeks of back-to-back meetings. Business trips became more frequent, his return home feeling less like a reunion and more like an inconvenient stop between obligations. The love he once shared with Sophie, the one that had been his anchor, began to feel like something from another lifetime. At first, she tried to reach him. She waited up for him, even when he staggered in past midnight, exhausted but wired from the high of another successful deal. She planned quiet dinners, hoping to reclaim the warmth they had once shared, only to eat alone when he called to say he'd be working late. She told herself it was just temporary, that once things stabilized, once the business reached a certain point, he would come back to her. But he never did. Nathan had become a man she barely recognized. Polished, calculated, driven by an ambition that left little room for anything else. The Nathan who used to hold her hand beneath the dinner table, who whispered inside jokes to make her laugh at the most inappropriate moments, was gone. In his place was someone who existed for the deal, the acquisition, the image. And the worst part, he didn't even seem to notice what was slipping away. The silence between them. The shift wasn't sudden. It wasn't one big fight, one explosive moment that tore them apart. It was the quiet that did it. The nights where their conversations were nothing more than passing mentions of schedules and deadlines. The mornings where she woke up alone, stretching her hand across the bed, only to find cold sheets where he should have been. The way he seemed more present in his phone, his laptop, his empire, than he ever was with her. Sophie wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand that he see her again. But instead, she swallowed the pain, convinced herself that she was overreacting, that if she just held on a little longer, things would change. Until, one day, she realized she wasn't holding on to anything at all. The other woman. Sophie noticed Amelia Whitmore long before Nathan did. She was smart, too smart. Sharp-minded and effortlessly confident, Amelia had started as a junior associate in Nathan's company, but she didn't stay in the background for long. Nathan praised her constantly. "She's got real vision," he had said over dinner one night, scrolling through emails on his phone, barely glancing up. "She understands how I think. It's refreshing." At first, Sophie had brushed it off. Nathan worked with plenty of intelligent women. What difference did one more make? But it wasn't just what he said about Amelia. It was how he said it. The way his voice carried a hint of admiration that Sophie hadn't heard directed at her in a long time. The way his eyes lit up when he talked about their latest project. The way, little by little, Amelia's name started replacing hers in every conversation. And then came the nights when he didn't come home at all. The beginning of the end. Sophie wasn't stupid. She knew that love didn't just die overnight. It withered. It faded. It eroded beneath the weight of neglect, of loneliness, of the slow realization that one person had already moved on, while the other was still clinging to what once was. By the time their 6th wedding anniversary arrived, she had planned one final attempt to reach him. She cooked his favorite meal, lit candles, wore the dress, the one he used to say made her look like she had stepped out of a dream. She waited and waited. But when Nathan finally walked through the door, he didn't even notice. He was dressed in a sleek, tailored suit, his tie slightly loosened, the scent of champagne clinging to him. He looked perfect, polished, wealthy, powerful, and entirely indifferent to the woman standing before him. "You missed our anniversary," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Nathan barely glanced up as he set his phone on the counter. "I told you I had an event tonight." Sophie felt something inside her snap. An event? Her voice trembled, but not with sadness, with anger. Or another excuse to spend the night with Amelia? His head snapped up, his brows furrowed. What the hell is that supposed to mean? And suddenly all of it came pouring out. Every unspoken hurt, every lonely night, every moment she had felt like a ghost in their own home. She told him how she felt invisible, how she had spent years standing in his shadow, not waiting for him to come back to her, only to realize that he never would. Nathan fought back. He accused her of being ungrateful, of not understanding the pressure he was under. "I built all of this for us, Sophie," she laughed bitterly, tears burning in her eyes. "No, Nathan, you built this for you, and in the process, you lost us." She didn't even remember packing, didn't remember how she ended up in the car, driving away with nothing but a small bag and a heart that felt like it had been shattered into a million pieces. She had walked away hoping he would stop her, hoping he would fight for her. But Nathan didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stood there, silent as she left. And that was the moment Sophie knew. He had already let go. Sophie had always known that relationships didn't end in an instant. There was no dramatic explosion, no single moment where everything shattered at once. Instead, love faded like an old photograph, slowly, gradually, until one day, all that remained was the memory of what once was. And Amelia Whitmore had played her part in that fading perfectly. From the very beginning, she had positioned herself just close enough to Nathan without stepping over any obvious lines. She wasn't overtly flirtatious, nor did she ever speak ill of Sophie directly. Instead, she wove herself into his world with a quiet precision that was almost admirable in its calculation. It started subtly. Small acts of loyalty that made her indispensable. She anticipated Nathan's needs before he even voiced them. She stayed late when he did, handled crises effortlessly, and built a reputation as the one person who truly understood his vision. And when Sophie voiced her concerns, Nathan had dismissed them with a tired sigh. "Amelia's just a colleague," he had said once, barely glancing up from his laptop. "She's just helping out. You're overthinking things." But Sophie wasn't overthinking. She saw the way Amelia looked at Nathan, the way her hand would linger just a second too long on his arm when passing him a report, the way her laughter rang just a little too sweet when he made a passing joke. And more than that, she saw the way Nathan looked back at her. It wasn't the way he used to look at Sophie. It wasn't filled with warmth or familiarity. It was curiosity, admiration, like a man who had spent too long in the same life, staring at the same view, and had just discovered a new horizon. The power of influence. Amelia never told Nathan to leave Sophie outright. She didn't have to. Instead, she planted seeds, subtle whispers of doubt that took root in his mind over time. She framed Sophie's frustrations as a lack of understanding. "She just doesn't see how hard you work," Amelia would say, shaking her head in sympathy after yet another long day at the office. She painted Nathan as the victim, a man burdened by a wife who didn't support his ambitions. "She should be proud of you, Nathan," she mused one evening as they rode together to a client dinner. "Most women would kill to be with a man like you." And so, when the arguments between Nathan and Sophie grew more frequent, when Sophie's patience wore thin, when her words sharpened with disappointment, it became easy for Nathan to believe exactly what Amelia wanted him to believe. That he wasn't the problem. That Sophie was. The breaking point. By the time Sophie walked away, Amelia didn't rush in to take her place. No, she waited. She let Nathan mourn. Let him sit in the cold, empty house he had once shared with his wife. Let him nurse his wounded pride. And when the time was right, she stepped in. Not as a replacement, but as the solution to all the problems Sophie had supposedly created. She was everything Sophie had stopped being. Where Sophie had grown frustrated, Amelia was endlessly patient. Where Sophie had questioned his choices, Amelia praised him. Where Sophie had tried to remind him of the man he used to be, Amelia celebrated the man he had become. She didn't just enter his life, she became essential to it. And before long, she was everywhere. At first, she remained his trusted right hand at work. Then the lines blurred. Business trips stretched into long dinners, conversations turned more personal. Until one evening, Nathan realized he wasn't alone anymore. And for a while, that was enough. A new chapter. Nathan and Amelia's relationship wasn't built on passion, it was built on alignment. They shared the same goals, the same hunger for success. She fit effortlessly into his world, never demanding more than what he was willing to give. And when they finally made their relationship public, it was met with polite applause. Their engagement, a predictable next step. Their wedding, a grand affair fit for a power couple. Nathan convinced himself that this was how things were meant to be. He had moved forward. Sophie was his past, and Amelia was his future. But as he stood in that glittering ballroom, surrounded by champagne and congratulations, he didn't expect his past to come walking through the door. He didn't expect to see Sophie Carter dressed in a plain server's uniform, clearing plates at his own wedding reception. And he sure as hell didn't expect to see her pregnant. The illusion cracks, Nathan's entire world tilted. His first instinct was denial. This couldn't be happening. Sophie couldn't be here, working at this event, carrying a child that, if his calculations were correct, could only be his. His second instinct was anger. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she chosen to suffer in silence rather than demand what was rightfully hers? And his third instinct, the one he didn't want to acknowledge, was regret. Because as he looked at her, standing there with quiet defiance, her hands tightening around the tray she held, he realized something Amelia had never managed to make him feel. Remorse. He had rewritten history, convinced himself that Sophie had been the one who failed him, that she hadn't fought hard enough, hadn't understood his vision, hadn't supported him the way Amelia had. But now, faced with the undeniable truth, he saw things for what they really were. It hadn't been Sophie who had given up. It had been him. And now he wasn't sure if he could ever fix what he had broken. Nathan could still feel the weight of Sophie's presence long after she disappeared into the sea of guests. His mind raced, heart hammering in his chest as he tried to process what he had just seen. She was pregnant. That much was undeniable. The curve of her stomach wasn't something he could ignore, no matter how much his brain screamed at him to focus on the night at hand, on his new wife, on the people here to celebrate his new beginning. But how could this be a new beginning when the past had just walked through the door, carrying proof that it had never truly ended? He turned toward Amelia, but her sharp gaze was already locked onto him, reading every unspoken thought that flashed across his face. She knew something was wrong. Of course, she did. Amelia was too perceptive, too calculating to miss the way his entire body had tensed the moment he saw Sophie. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Who is she?" Nathan hesitated. A lie would be easy, but the truth was already unraveling in his mind. He exhaled, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. "Someone I used to know." Amelia didn't buy it. He could tell by the slight narrowing of her eyes, the way she pursed her lips. But before she could press further, they were interrupted by yet another guest, one of the many people waiting to shake his hand, to congratulate him on the life he had built. Nathan went through the motions, offering tight smiles and measured responses, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He kept scanning the room, searching for Sophie, needing to see her again, to confirm that she wasn't some ghost his conscience had conjured up. When he finally caught sight of her near the back of the room, she was moving swiftly, focused on her work, deliberately avoiding looking in his direction. He couldn't let this go. Under the guise of needing fresh air, he excused himself from Amelia's side and slipped toward the staff entrance, following the path Sophie had taken moments earlier. His pulse pounded in his ears as he rounded the corner and found her standing near the kitchen, methodically stacking trays, her back to him. "Sophie." She froze for the briefest second before straightening her posture, adjusting the tray in her hands. When she turned around, her expression was unreadable. "What do you want, Nathan?" Her voice was calm, too calm. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You're pregnant." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Brilliant observation." His jaw tightened. "Is it mine?" Sophie didn't answer right away. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't, that she would walk away and leave him standing there with nothing but the weight of his own assumptions. But then she met his gaze, eyes steady, unwavering. "Yes." The single word knocked the breath from his lungs. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't soften her expression, or give him any indication that she wanted his reaction to be anything other than what it was. Stunned silence. "You never told me," he managed to say. "You never asked," she shot back, and for the first time the composure in her voice cracked just slightly. His hands clenched at his sides. "That's not fair, Sophie. I didn't know. How could I have?" "You didn't care, Nathan." She cut him off, her voice sharp now, laced with something that almost sounded like exhaustion. "You were too busy building your empire, playing house with Amelia, pretending I never existed. I wasn't going to beg for your attention." Guilt curled in his stomach. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that she had always mattered, that she still mattered. But the truth sat between them, like a wall too thick to break through. The memory of their last night together crashed into him. He had stood there, watching her walk away, convinced that if she had really wanted to stay, she would have fought harder. But now, as he looked at her standing before him, pregnant with his child, working a job she never should have had to take, he wondered if he had ever truly seen her at all. "I didn't know," he said again, softer this time. Sophie shook her head, as if shaking off whatever emotion threatened to surface. "Well, now you do." She adjusted the tray in her hands and stepped around him, walking away before he could find the words to stop her. Nathan stood there, rooted in place, watching her go, knowing with every fiber of his being that this moment, this revelation, had just changed everything. Nathan had always believed that success was the ultimate validation, that once he had built an empire, surrounded himself with wealth and power, everything else would fall into place. But standing there, watching Sophie walk away from him, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: regret. The days following the wedding reception were a blur. Nathan moved through them mechanically, shaking hands, attending meetings, and playing the role he had spent years perfecting. From the outside, nothing had changed. He was still the same man, wealthy, respected, admired. But inside, he felt unsettled. No matter how hard he tried to push the thoughts away, Sophie's face kept flashing in his mind. The way she had looked at him, not with anger, but with indifference. As if he was just another guest at that event, another person she had to endure rather than someone she had once loved. And the baby. His baby. Nathan had never imagined himself as a father. He had spent too many years consumed by his work, by the chase, by the idea that love, family was something that could wait. But now, it wasn't just a distant possibility. It was real. The thought of Sophie going through this alone, carrying his child while working long hours just to make ends meet, made something tighten in his chest. He had once promised to take care of her, to build a life where she would never have to struggle. But in the end, she had been left to fend for herself while he stood on stages accepting awards for his achievements. The realization hit him harder than any business failure ever had. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure if all of this, the money, the power, the influence, had been worth what it had cost him. Amelia sensed the shift immediately. She had always prided herself on understanding Nathan better than anyone. She knew how his mind worked, how to anticipate his next move before he even made it. But something was different now. He was distant, distracted, and worst of all, he wasn't telling her why. At first, she let it slide. She assumed it was exhaustion, the weight of public expectations settling on his shoulders after their high-profile wedding. But when she caught him lost in thought too many times, staring at nothing, checking his phone like he was waiting for a call that never came, she knew. She waited until they were alone in their penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You've been off," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Since the wedding." Nathan didn't look up. He was nursing a glass of whiskey, his fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. "I've been busy." Amelia's lips pressed together. "Nathan," he sighed, finally setting the glass down. When he turned to her, there was an edge of exhaustion in his expression, but also something else, hesitation. "I saw someone at the reception," he admitted. Her posture stiffened. "Who?" He hesitated just long enough for her to put the pieces together. She had noticed the way he had disappeared that night, how his mood had shifted. Now she knew why. "Sophie," she said flatly. Nathan didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. Amelia exhaled slowly, her grip tightening around the stem of her wineglass. "And?" "She's pregnant." A beat of silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Amelia's fingers twitched, but her expression remained eerily composed. "Is it yours?" Nathan's jaw clenched. He didn't have to answer. They both knew the truth. Amelia let out a sharp breath, setting her wine down harder than necessary. "So what? She shows up after all these months, carrying your child, and suddenly you..." She cut herself off, shaking her head. "This is exactly what she wants, Nathan. She wants to pull you back in." He frowned. "You don't know that. She left you." Amelia shot back, eyes flashing. "She didn't fight for you, didn't tell you she was pregnant. She just disappeared. And now, when you've moved on, she conveniently shows up?" Nathan bristled. "She didn't conveniently show up. She was working, Amelia. She wasn't trying to get my attention." Amelia let out a dry laugh. "And you believe that?" His silence was answer enough. She shook her head, crossing her arms. Nathan, you've worked too hard to let her drag you back into whatever mess she's created. She made her choice. His stomach twisted at her words. Had Sophie made a choice, or had he made it for her? Standing there in their kitchen the night she left, letting her walk away without saying a damn thing to stop her? The conversation ended there, but the tension remained. Amelia didn't press him further, but she didn't have to. Nathan knew this wasn't over. That night, as Amelia slept beside him, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when exactly he had become the kind of man who let the woman he loved suffer in silence. It didn't matter what had happened between them. It didn't matter how much time had passed, how much had changed. Sophie was carrying his child, and whether she wanted him there or not, he wasn't going to ignore that. Nathan had spent years perfecting the art of control over his business, his reputation, his future. But as he drove through the dimly lit streets that night, hands gripping the wheel a little too tightly, he felt something unraveling inside him. He had tried to bury it, to tell himself that Sophie's pregnancy didn't change anything. But the truth was, it changed everything. It wasn't just the shock of seeing her again, or the fact that she was carrying his child. It was the realization that she had been alone through all of it, while he had been celebrating a wedding. The thought made him sick. By the time he pulled up in front of the modest apartment complex Sophie lived in, his heartbeat was a steady drum in his chest. He hadn't planned what he was going to say. All he knew was that walking away from her, wasn't an option. He knocked, stepping back slightly as the door creaked open. Sophie stood there, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she sighed, crossing her arms. "I should have known you'd show up." Nathan swallowed hard. "We need to talk." Sophie exhaled sharply, leaning against the doorframe. "There's nothing to talk about, Nathan." "Yes, there is." His voice was firm, unwavering. "You're having my child." Something flickered in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place. "I know," she said, "and I'm handling it." His chest tightened. Alone? Her jaw clenched, but she didn't deny it. Nathan glanced past her into the apartment. It was small but clean, the kind of place that spoke of quiet resilience. A stack of baby clothes sat neatly folded on the couch. A crib, half assembled, leaned against the far wall. Guilt twisted in his stomach. She had been preparing for their child alone, while he had been oblivious, caught up in a world that suddenly felt shallow compared to this. "I should have been there," he said quietly. Sophie let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, well, you weren't." He took a step closer. "Let me be now." She hesitated, her fingers tightening against her arms. "Nathan, I don't need your guilt," she said finally. "I don't need you showing up because you feel bad or because you suddenly realized I exist again." He flinched. He deserved that. "This isn't about guilt," he said. "It's about doing what's right." Sophie searched his face, and for the first time that night, something cracked in her guarded expression. A long silence stretched between them. Then finally she stepped aside. "Fine," she said. "You want to talk? Then come in." Nathan exhaled, stepping inside, knowing this was only the beginning. Nathan stepped inside, taking in the small but well-kept space. The apartment was nothing like the luxurious penthouse he and Sophie had once shared, but there was something about it. Something warm, something real. It wasn't just a place to live. It was a home. His eyes drifted to the crib, still in pieces, pushed against the wall. Next to it, baby clothes sat in neat stacks, folded with care. A small rocking chair sat in the corner, a blanket draped over its arm. Every detail hit him like a punch to the gut. Sophie had been preparing for their child without him. She closed the door behind him and crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "Say what you need to say, Nathan." He turned to face her fully. "I need to be involved." Sophie let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "And what does that mean to you? Writing a check? Sending a gift every birthday?" He clenched his jaw. "I don't want to throw money at this. I want to be here." She studied him, her arms still crossed as if she were holding herself together. "You're a little late, don't you think?" Nathan exhaled, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "I know I messed up. I know I wasn't there when you needed me. But I swear to you, Sophie, I didn't know." "If I had?" He stopped, shaking his head. "If I had, nothing would have kept me away." Her expression didn't soften. "But you didn't know because you never asked. You never even looked back." The words hit their mark. He had told himself that Sophie had left because she didn't want him anymore, because she had given up on them. But the truth was, he had let her go. He had let his pride, his ambition, and his stubborn refusal to see what was right in front of him push her away. And now, here she was, standing in front of him, carrying his child, and all he could think about was how much time he had lost. "I want to fix this," he said quietly. She scoffed. "You don't just get to fix it, Nathan. This isn't a deal you can negotiate or a problem you can throw solutions at until it goes away. This is my life. And soon, it's going to be our baby's life." He nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but let me start somewhere." Sophie stared at him for a long time, something unreadable in her eyes. Then with a sigh, she turned toward the couch and sank down onto it. "If you're serious," she said, "then prove it." Nathan didn't hesitate. "I will." Sophie looked at him, searching for any trace of the man she used to know, the one she had loved before ambition had swallowed him whole. "Then don't just say it, Nathan." Her voice was quieter now, but still firm. "Show me." He met her gaze, determination settling deep in his chest. That was exactly what he intended to do. Nathan wasn't sure what he had expected after that night. Maybe a chance to prove himself, maybe some small opening where he could wedge his way back into Sophie's life. But the days that followed were a brutal reminder that trust wasn't given. It was earned. Sophie didn't make it easy for him. She didn't call. She didn't ask for anything. If anything, she acted as if their conversation had never happened. Nathan was the one who had to reach out first, the one who had to remind her, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." At first, she barely responded. When he texted, she kept her answers short. When he showed up at her apartment with groceries, she accepted them without much reaction, offering nothing more than a quiet thanks before closing the door. But he didn't stop. He brought things she would never ask for: prenatal vitamins, comfortable slippers for her swollen feet, meals from her favorite restaurants. Not because he wanted to impress her, but because he was paying attention now. Because he was seeing her, really seeing her, in a way he hadn't for a long time. And slowly, so slowly it was almost perceptible, the ice between them began to thaw. One evening, as he was setting a bag of groceries down on her counter, she finally spoke. "You don't have to keep doing this, you know?" He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I want to." She studied him for a long moment, something cautious flickering in her gaze. "That doesn't mean you get to rewrite the past, Nathan." "I know." He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "But it means I can show you who I am now." Sophie didn't say anything after that, but she didn't push him away either. It was a small victory, but he'd take it. Days passed, then weeks. Nathan started showing up not just with things, but with time. He asked about her doctor's appointments. He offered to drive her when she didn't feel up to it. He sat next to her in waiting rooms, watching her fingers nervously twist in her lap as they waited to hear the baby's heartbeat. And then one day, something shifted. She let him in. It wasn't much. Just a simple moment, a fleeting crack in the walls she had built between them. They were sitting in her living room, folding tiny baby clothes together, when she sighed and said, almost to herself, "I don't even know if I'll be any good at this." Nathan glanced at her. "At what?" She gestured to the pile of onesies in front of them. "Being a mom." The vulnerability in her voice knocked the air from his lungs. He set the clothes down and turned toward her. "Sophie, you're already doing this. You're already thinking about everything, planning for everything. That kid is the luckiest in the world to have you." She didn't respond right away, but she didn't brush him off either. Instead, for the first time in a long time, she let him stay a little longer. And for Nathan, that was everything. Nathan had never been the kind of man to back down from a challenge. But this was different. This wasn't about negotiations or market strategies. This wasn't about winning. This was about proving, day after day, that he wasn't the man Sophie had every right to believe he was. And it was exhausting. Not because he didn't want to be there, but because for the first time in his life, his words meant nothing. Sophie didn't trust him. Not yet. And maybe she never would. But that didn't stop him. He showed up, over and over. When she needed a ride to a doctor's appointment, he was there. When she hesitated, saying she could handle it herself, he didn't argue. He just stood by the door, waiting, until she sighed and grabbed her coat. When she mentioned offhandedly that she was craving something sweet, he showed up the next day with her favorite pastries, not because he expected a thank you, but because he wanted to. And eventually, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't some grand revelation. It was small, barely noticeable. But one day when he knocked on her door, she didn't hesitate before letting him in. One evening, when he dropped off dinner, she didn't wait until he left to eat it. And then, one night as they sat in her living room, half-assembling baby furniture, she sighed and muttered, "I hate these instruction manuals." Without thinking, he grinned. "I think they're intentionally written to break people's spirits." And then, she laughed. It was soft, barely there, but real. For the first time in a long time, Nathan felt something settle in his chest. Hope. He wasn't foolish enough to think this meant everything was fixed. But for now, for this moment, it was enough. Nathan never thought he'd be the kind of man to sit in a dimly lit doctor's office, heart pounding in his chest, waiting to hear the sound of his child's heartbeat for the first time. But here he was. The air in the room felt heavier than it should have, thick with unspoken words and a cautious distance that still remained between him and Sophie. She sat beside him on the exam table, arms crossed over her stomach, her face unreadable. She hadn't wanted him here. He knew that. She hadn't asked him to come, but when he showed up at her door that morning, she didn't argue. She just sighed, grabbed her coat, and said, "Let's go." That was more than enough for him. The doctor entered, offering them both a polite smile before getting to work. Sophie lay back on the exam table, her breath steady but tight, as if she was bracing for something. Nathan had never felt more out of place, sitting there like an outsider looking in on something he should have been a part of from the beginning. And then, the sound filled the room. A rapid, rhythmic thump-thump-thump pulsed from the monitor, echoing through the space like something out of a dream. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. That was his child. His world, his priorities, everything he had thought mattered, it all shrunk in that moment, narrowing to the steady beat of a tiny heart that was somehow his responsibility. Beside him, Sophie turned her head slightly, watching him carefully, as if waiting for some kind of reaction. He swallowed hard, blinking against the sharp burn in his eyes. That's the baby?" His voice barely came out. The doctor smiled. "That's your baby." Nathan exhaled slowly, staring at the screen, unable to look away. He felt something in his chest tighten, something unfamiliar, something terrifying. Love. Real, unshakable, terrifying love for something he hadn't even met yet. Sophie must have seen something in his face because she looked away quickly, her fingers twitching against the exam table. When the doctor handed her a small printout of the ultrasound, she hesitated for the briefest moment before handing it to Nathan instead. "Here," she murmured. His hands shook slightly as he took it. The image was blurry, just a small figure surrounded by shadows. But to him, it was clearer than anything else in his life. He looked up at Sophie, his throat tight. "Thank you." She didn't answer right away, but this time she didn't pull away either. Nathan had never been one to believe in defining moments. Those split seconds where everything shifts, where something inside you changes so completely that there's no going back. But sitting there, staring at the ultrasound picture in his hands, he realized this was one of them. The weight of it settled deep in his chest. This wasn't just some distant responsibility, some abstract idea of fatherhood that he could push to the back of his mind while he focused on business deals and networking events. This was real. This was his child, and for the first time in his life he was afraid. Afraid of failing. Afraid of repeating the same mistakes that had brought him and Sophie to this place. Afraid that he wasn't enough. They rode back to her apartment in silence. Sophie sat beside him in the car, her hands resting lightly over her stomach, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past them. She had let him come to the appointment. She had let him hear their child's heartbeat. But that didn't mean she had let him in. As he pulled up in front of her building, she reached for the door handle, pausing only for a second before saying, "Nathan." He turned, gripping the steering wheel. "Yeah?" She hesitated. That was new. Sophie never hesitated. She always knew exactly what she wanted to say, always carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who refused to be shaken. But right now she looked unsure. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you again, she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if we can ever be what we were. Nathan felt those words like a blow to the chest, but he didn't flinch. He nodded because she deserved honesty. I know. She looked down at her hands. But I want our child to have a father. His throat tightened. Then let me be one. She met his gaze, something fragile flickering in her eyes. I need to see it, Nathan. Not just for a week or a month. I need to see that this isn't just some temporary guilt fix. He exhaled, nodding. You will. Sophie held his gaze for a second longer, before giving a small nod of her own. Then, without another word, she stepped out of the car and walked inside, disappearing behind the heavy apartment door. Nathan sat there for a long time, gripping the ultrasound picture in his hands. This wasn't the end. It wasn't a resolution. It was something else entirely. A second chance. Fragile and uncertain, but real. And this time he wasn't going to waste it. Nathan had spent months proving to Sophie and to himself that he was capable of being more than just a man haunted by his mistakes. He wasn't perfect. He didn't expect forgiveness overnight. But he showed up. Every doctor's appointment, every late-night craving run, every moment Sophie needed someone, even when she wouldn't ask for it. And when the day finally came, when Sophie gripped his hand in the hospital room, pain and exhaustion etched across her face, he had never felt more terrified in his life. The world blurred into a haze of beeping monitors, hurried voices, and a crushing sense of helplessness as he watched her struggle through labor. But then, the cry. That first tiny wail that shattered the air, that reached deep into his chest and cracked something wide open. And just like that, he was a father. When the nurse placed the baby in Sophie's arms, Nathan couldn't move. His hands trembled at his sides as he stared at the tiny, fragile life wrapped in soft hospital blankets. Sophie turned her head, breathless, exhausted, but when she looked at him, there was no hesitation in her voice. Do you want to hold him? Nathan swallowed hard, nodding. Carefully, as if afraid he might break the small bundle, he reached out. And when his son was placed into his arms for the first time, everything changed. The world outside didn't matter. Not the money, not the business, not the mistakes that had once defined him. All that mattered was this moment. The baby let out a tiny sigh, shifting slightly, his impossibly small fingers curling near Nathan's chest, and in that instant he knew this was love. The kind that doesn't fade, doesn't demand anything in return, the kind that stays. Nathan blinked against the burning in his eyes. Hey, buddy, he murmured, his voice rough, unsteady. Sophie watched them, silent, but something in her expression softened, just a little. She had been waiting for proof, for action, instead of words. And now, as she looked at Nathan holding their son, she finally saw what she had needed to see. This wasn't just guilt. This wasn't temporary. Nathan was here, and he wasn't leaving. For the first time, in what felt like forever, Sophie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Maybe, just maybe, this was a beginning worth believing in. So, we've reached the end of this story. And if you're still here, watching, listening, feeling, then something about it must have touched you. Maybe it stirred up an old memory. Maybe it made you pause, reflect, or even question something in your own life. Stories have a way of doing that. They hold up a mirror to our emotions, our regrets, our hopes. They remind us that life is fragile, that love is complicated, that time moves forward whether we're ready or not. For some of you, this story might have felt personal. Maybe you've lost someone you loved. Maybe you've been on the receiving end of regret, or maybe you're the one who carries it. For others, it might have been a lesson about second chances, about what it means to show up when it matters most. But no matter what brought you here, I want you to take something with you. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one." We spend so much of our lives looking backward, at what we lost, what we should have done differently, the moments that slipped through our fingers. But the truth is, life doesn't wait for us to figure it out. The past won't change, no matter how much we replay it in our minds. What we have, what we've always had, is right now. At this very moment, your heart is beating, your lungs are filling with air, your body is working tirelessly to keep you alive. And yet how often do we stop to appreciate that? To simply sit in the moment, without running toward the next thing, the next distraction, the next excuse. The world around us is loud, filled with expectations, pressures, the weight of things we can't control. But zoom out for just a second. Imagine standing in the middle of an open field, looking up at the sky. The sun still rises, the earth still spins, the stars still burn millions of miles away, completely indifferent to our daily worries. Life is happening, whether we embrace it or not. And here's the thing. Pain is not the end of the story. Heartbreak, failure, loss, they feel permanent when you're in them. But even the darkest nights have a sunrise waiting on the other side. And sometimes the most painful endings are just disguised beginnings. Confucius once said, "It does not matter how slowly you go, as long as you do not stop." So maybe this is your sign, your reminder that whatever you're going through, it's shaping you. That every mistake, every misstep, every regret is not meant to define you, but to teach you. And if this story meant something to you, don't just keep it inside. Send it to someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment. Tell me what part of it resonated with you. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because we're all just figuring this out together. And above all, choose kindness, not just for others, but for yourself. Because in the end, life isn't about having all the answers. It's about showing up, learning, and loving, even when it's hard. I appreciate you, I see you, and I'm grateful you're here.